So, I finished Resident Evil Requiem, and honestly, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. You know when you finish a game and it kind of just sticks with you for a while? That weird moment when you sit through the credits and you're just like, yeah, I think that was something special I just played. And that was pretty much me with Requiem. The funny thing is, I actually started playing it again like almost immediately after finishing it. Not because like I miss things, but because I wanted to just experience that atmosphere again. That feeling of being in that world. For me, this is easily one of the best Resident Evil games we've had since Resident Evil 4. And I know that's a big statement considering how strong the series has been lately with games like Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil Village and the remakes. But Requiem feels different. It feels like Capcom finally found this perfect balance between two sides of Resident Evil that have always kind of fought each other. The slow, oppressive horror and the chaotic, high-intensity action. And what makes Requiem so interesting is it doesn't just try to mix those things together randomly, instead it separates them through its characters. Grace represents the horror, whereas Leon represents the action. And somehow the game manages to blend those two experiences together in a way that feels incredibly natural. So in this video, I just want to talk about my experience with Resident Evil Requiem, what makes it work so well, why the atmosphere stuck with me so much, and why I genuinely think this might be one of the best entries in the series in a long time. Obviously this video will contain full spoilers for the game, so if you haven't finished it yet, you've been warned. Although it has been out for a while, so if you haven't finished it at this point, then get it done. But if you have finished it, or you just want to hear someone ramble about how much they loved it, let's talk about Resident Evil Requiem. One of the first things I want to talk about is the atmosphere of the game and why it feels different. One of the first things that stood out to me in Resident Evil Requiem was the atmosphere. And Resident Evil has always been good at atmosphere, but this game feels like it really leans into that dark, uneasy feeling in a way that reminded me a lot of like older survival horror games. There's like a constant sense that something is wrong, even when nothing is happening. The environments are quiet in a very deliberate way. You hear distant sounds, creaking structures, wind moving through broken spaces. Sometimes the game lets you sit in silence for just long enough that your brain starts expecting something terrible to happen. More often than not, something terrible does happen. And that tension is what makes the horror work so well. A lot of modern horror games rely on constant scares or loud moments, but Requiem does something smart. It builds dread. When you're walking through one of the darker sections of the game, especially during Grace's segments, the world feels heavy, like every hallway might hide something waiting for you. And what I really appreciate is that the game doesn't rush you through these moments. It allows the player to exist inside the tension. You're exploring slowly, checking corners, listening carefully to the environment. And that slow pace is exactly what makes the horror feel real. And just to talk about Grace's side of the game, which is definitely the more horror side of the game, Grace's gameplay is where the horror in Requiem really shines. Compared to Leon, she feels a lot more vulnerable, not helpless, but definitely more fragile. You don't feel like an action hero when you're playing as Grace. You feel like someone trying to survive something that's way bigger than them. And I love that about Grace's section. Because survival horror works best when players feel uncertain. When you're playing as Grace, every encounter feels risky. You're thinking about positioning, your resources, escape routes. Sometimes the smartest choice isn't fighting, it's avoiding the fight entirely. There were moments in our section where I generally slowed down my pace just because I didn't trust what might be around the next corner. And those are the moments that remind me why I love horror games so much. It's not about adrenaline, it's about intentional tension. The fear of the unknown. And I think Grace's gameplay captures that perfectly. And then you have Leon, and the shift when the game moves to his perspective is honestly kind of brilliant. Where Grace's sections are slow and tense, Leon's gameplay is much more aggressive. You have more firepower, more mobility, and more confidence in combat. And you have more one-liners, which is always fun when you're playing as Leon.
Excuse me.
The enemies in his section are still dangerous, but the dynamic really does change. Instead of feeling like prey, you start to feel like a hunter. But what's really interesting is that the game doesn't completely abandon horror during Leon's segments. The atmosphere is still there, but it's mixed with that classic Resident Evil action energy. This is where the game reminded me a lot of Resident Evil 4. You're so cautious, but you're also capable. And that balance creates some of the most exciting moments in the game. There were sections where I found myself completely locked in, managing enemies, moving through environments, trying to stay one step ahead of the chaos. And it feels so satisfying when everything clicks together. The decision to split the game between Grace and Leon might actually be the smartest design choice in Requiem. Because instead of forcing one playstyle across the entire game, the developers embrace both sides of Resident Evil's identity. Grace keeps the horror alive, Leon delivers the action fans expect. And when the game switches between them, it keeps the experience fresh. You never get too comfortable. Just when you start to feel powerful Leon, the game throws you back into Grace's perspective, where suddenly everything feels dangerous again. And that contrast makes both sides stronger. If the entire game played like Leon's sections, the horror might start to fade. And if the entire game played like Grace's sections, some players might miss the excitement of the action. But together, they create this really unique rhythm, I think.
I don't want any more regrets. Whatever it takes, count me in.
So, the story of Resident Evil, which I would describe as more of a personal story. Resident Evil stories can sometimes get kind of ridiculous, and that's part of the charm, honestly. But what I appreciated about Requiem is that the story feels a bit more grounded emotionally. It focuses more on characters and their experiences rather than just massive global threats. Grace's journey especially feels personal. You see the fear, the uncertainty, the struggle to understand what's going on around her, and then she slowly becomes more sure of herself, and we see her become a bit more certain, especially at the end when she's kind of figured things out, and her and Leon are getting ready to face Xeno, and she tells Leon that she's got a plan for Elpis, and Leon trusts her. And Leon works really well as the experienced counterpart to Grace. He's been through this world before, he understands the horrors of bioweapons and the corruption behind them. But even for him, the events of Requiem feel heavy. We see when he arrives in Raccoon City again, and he enters the RPD after all those years since the outbreak. Leon hasn't forgotten. This guy was once a rookie cop, green as ever, not understanding the events going on around him. Very similar to Grace and how she is at the start of this game. But now he's older, and he's probably a little bit jaded as well. I mean, think about how long this guy's been doing this, fighting against the corruption and bioweapons. But he's still that same rookie that joined the force to help people and tries his best to save anyone he can. The moment that kind of stands out for me a little bit, I think, is when he goes to the gun shop outside the RPD, and he sees the skeleton of Kendo, I think it is, from the gun shop from Resident Evil 2, and he starts getting flashbacks of those events. This really kind of showed that Leon's he'll always remember those that he couldn't save, and it weighs on him heavy, and you can really see that in this game, and I love that. And I think that emotional weight adds a lot to the experience, because when the story slows down and lets the characters breathe, it makes the bigger moments hit harder. And While I'm talking about Leon in the RPD, one thing I wanted to mention was the music. In general, I think the music is pretty spot on in this game, but that music when he's in the RPD, that stuff like really hit. To be fair, I was loving that. There was a point where I just kind of stopped and started appreciating like what the music that was playing. It was really nice. There are a few moments in Requiem that I genuinely can't stop thinking about, not because they're loud or shocking, but because they're disturbing in a quiet way. Moments where the environment itself feels wrong. Moments where the game makes you question what's about to happen next. Those scenes stick with you because they tap into psychological horror instead of surface level scares. And Resident Evil at its best has always understood that. The scariest things are often the ones you don't fully see. I think some specific moments that stood out to me were maybe at the start with Grace's section, when the girl, the stalker enemy of this game, is revealed. It's not even like a big bombastic moment. It's just Grace is inspecting a dead body, and all of a sudden the hand just appears and just starts chowing down on this dead body. Like, that stuff was creepy as hell, and it really added to that horror of the game, and I loved that. There was the moments where you were underground trying to save Emily, I think it was. I can't remember the name of the exact title, but you're taking the electrical plugs out, and you're trying to like escape that area. And again, the girl is there, and that was really good because the girl is obviously weak to light. So like whenever you would use one of the plugs, the lights would come on, so you would feel safe. But the moment you had to like take one out to move to the next part of that section, it would get dark, and all of a sudden the tension would rise again. So I think they did a really good job at the horror in this game. It was really good. The fact that I'm immediately start replaying this game says a lot about how much I enjoyed it as well. And on a second playthrough, something interesting happens. You start noticing little details that you missed the first time, like environmental storytelling, small bits of dialogue, foreshadowing, and that's usually the sign of a well-designed game world, I think. When the experience gets better, the more you spend time in it. And I'd said earlier that this might be the best Resident Evil since RE4. And calling something the best Resident Evil since RE4 is a pretty bold statement, but honestly I think Requiem earns that conversation. Not because it tries to copy the past or anything, but because it understands what makes Resident Evil work. You know, it's got the tension, the atmosphere, memorable characters, and that constant balance between horror and action. I think since the kind of downfall era of like Resident Evil, Resident Evil 5 is fun, especially when you play it with friends, but it's not exactly one of the greatest Resident Evils. And then you have Resident Evil 6, and we all know how people feel about that. But I think after that era of Resident Evil, people, they have a bit of a weird opinion on the action parts of Resident Evil, but then Resident Evil 4 did it so well, and it also had those like horror moments as well. It's definitely more of an action game, but it has horror moments. But I think this game just strikes a perfect balance between the horror and action, because horror and action are things that are very, very much Resident Evil. I don't think you can have one or the other. I think you definitely need both. And some games lean more into one than the other, but I think, like I said, this one has that perfect balance and it embraces both, and I think that's why it feels so complete, this game. Resident Evil is one of those games, well, Resident Evil Requiem is one of those games that remind me why I love this series in the first place. It respects the roots of survival horror while still involving the formula. It gives us characters that feel different to play, and it creates an atmosphere that stays with you long after the game ends. For me, personally, this is one of the most memorable Resident Evil experiences in years, and the fact that I'm already replaying it probably says everything. If this is the direction that the series continues moving in, the future of Resident Evil is looking pretty amazing in my opinion. But I want to hear what you guys have to say about it, and let me know how you found this video. This is my first time, well, not my first time. I did something for Claire Obscure a while ago, but this is like, it's kind of like a new direction of like videos I want to try, like talking about games, my experiences and how I feel about them. So let me know what you guys think, and a like is always appreciated, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.